Okay, we're back. This next slide is something that I really like, and it's been kind of an inspiration for me over the last few years. Some of you that know me well know that I'm quite a U2 fan, and have been a fan of Bono for a long time. And if you know anything about him, you know he's done a lot of work with the One campaign and working with the poor in Africa in particular. A few years ago, 2006, he spoke at the Presidential Prayer Breakfast. There's a lot of video of that. If you care to go watch it, it's a good speech about dealing with the poor. But one thing he said is this: one thing we can all agree, all faiths, all ideologies, is that God is with the vulnerable and the poor. God is in the slums, in the cardboard boxes where the poor play house. God is in the silence of a mother who has infected her child with a virus that will end both their lives. God is in the cries heard under the rubble of war. God is in the debris of wasted opportunity and lives. And God is with us if we are with them. Solidarity with the poor is something that I believe is something that all Christians should be doing. And I think it's certainly something that people who are in the helping profession and in ministry should be doing. So I hope we'll be inspired to develop some sense of solidarity with the poor. I want us to look at, just for a minute, kind of culturally what the United States thinks poverty means. If you've been watching the news lately and seeing people who are kind of protesting about minimum wage and those sorts of things, you know that there's a lot of consternation out there about the question of whether someone can live on minimum wage. It's tough, and especially if a single person living on minimum wage is hard enough, but a couple of people making minimum wage and trying to support a family, even a small family, it's very, very difficult. So we've seen people that work at McDonald's protesting, wanting to make $14 an hour. That's not going to happen. But maybe there's something we can think about doing to help people in that situation a little bit more. And probably none of us are going to be people who make big decisions about government programs or any of those sorts of things. But we could be people who end up making decisions about what happens in our community. And we could be people who make decisions about how we deal with poor people on an individual basis. So let's look at what it means technically to be poor in America. You can see these are the guidelines from Health and Human Services from 2007, which is a few years ago, of course. And the numbers have gone up slightly since then, but not a lot. So in 2007, look down on the left side there. If you were a family of 4 in 2007 and you made $20,650, then you were right on the poverty line. This is what people refer to when they say poverty line. So that means if you were a family of 4 and you made $22,000, you are not considered to be living in poverty. That's an extremely low threshold. If you try to take care of a family of 4 on $22,000, that's going to be really difficult. If you're 2 people and you made $14,000, you weren't considered to be living in poverty. This is a tough line for people to take. Basically, what we're saying is, we don't consider you poor unless you're just absolutely destitute. And that's a difficult thing. Now, I know this is a governmental idea, and we don't live by everything that the federal government decides. But I want to show you this because I want you to think about and be really aware about how our culture as a whole thinks about poverty. And one of the things we do is we marginalize people by sometimes using numbers and using guidelines that say, again, well, you're not really what we would consider to be in poverty, even though the truth is you really are. But we restrict resources, we do all kinds of things like that to keep from looking as poor as we really are. So just a bit of information there. Now, here's the thing that I want us to spend a decent amount of time on, because this is one of those places where what we do in ministry and in therapy is really impacted, I think, by people's level of poverty and experiencing particularly what's called here generational poverty. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Ruby Payne. She's done some really good work in trying to describe people who live in generational poverty. She was and may still be, a principal of a school. She's not a psychology person. She's an educator, and she is school principal and administrator. And over her career, began to notice how the kids that they dealt with that grew up in poverty just thought differently, approached things differently, had different sets of values than kids who didn't live in poverty. So she began to work on that and do some research and writing about that, and basically came up with this kind of list and this kind of framework for thinking about people who live in generational poverty. Now, generational poverty is a particular experience. Generational poverty doesn't mean that I happen to be poor right now. Generational poverty means just what it sounds like, that maybe my grandparents were poor, maybe my great-grandparents were poor, but my parents certainly were poor, I'm poor, and the truth is probably my kids are going to be poor. That kind of situation, people who kind of grow up in that trend and live with that generationally, live a very different life than those of us who are more generationally middle class, and certainly those who are generationally in the upper socioeconomic strata. So we're talking specifically here about people who kind of live in a culture of poverty. They don't just happen to be poor now because somebody lost their job and then they lost their house, and those kinds of things are tragic and really difficult. But here we're kind of talking about people who live in a culture of poverty. And these would be people who live in inner city housing projects, who live in rural farm worker family poverty kinds of things, who have those low-level minimum wage or less than minimum wage jobs and barely get by, if they get by at all, and their kids don't get any higher education, and their kids get those kinds of jobs, and you kind of have that, again, a culture of poverty. What Ruby Payne says is those people develop certain specific characteristics in the way that they think, the way that they think about relationships, the way they think about their life, their future. And so here are some of those things in this list, and then we'll talk about them in a little different context. And this is not everything that she has to say. If you want to read about a little more about this, she has a little book that has all this information in it, and you can Google her up and look on Amazon, and you can find her books. She said, first of all, that within generational poverty, there's a significant value placed on nonverbal kinesthetic communication. That is, you communicate with your body. And that can be really obvious or really subtle. This is what you might see, and if you think about kind of stereotypical experience of some guys meet on the street, and they are kind of tough guys, and one of them looks at the other one, and the other one says, "What are you looking at?" And he didn't say anything, he just looked at him. But that look signifies something, maybe disrespect, maybe something else. If you've ever been on a subway in the middle of Chicago or New York or somewhere, and people are on the subway that you're a little scared of, one of the things we think is, well, just don't look them in the eye, don't look at them, because there's this sense of, well, if I look at someone, I'm going to offend them. So people who live in generational poverty tend to not be as verbal, maybe because they're not as well educated, maybe because they don't have the vocabulary that some of us who've grown up in other ways do, but they tend to communicate more kinesthetically, more with their body. or with a look, or a nod of the head, or that guy that looks at you, and instead of saying, "Hey, what's going on?" he just says, just lift his chin at you, and that's like, "What's up?" All right. Or somebody who gives you just a look, that look is a sexual look, or that look is an angry look, or that look is I don't care about you look. A lot of that happens in generational poverty. Now, if you think about that, you think about taking, say, a 7-year-old kid in a classroom or in your church, and thinking he's not going to communicate verbally as much as he does with his body. That makes a difference then in how we treat that kid. Second thing is ownership of people. When you grow up in generational poverty, you don't own much stuff. You may not have a great house. You may not have a great car. You may not have either one of those at all. But what you do have is your people. And your people kind of belong to you. And that becomes a really serious, really important thing. My brothers, my sisters, my mom, they're mine. They're my possessions. My children become like my possessions, the things that I own. And they give me a sense of value, not because necessarily of the relationship, but because they are something that I have that I can hold on to. We kind of see this with the 16-year-old girl who's terribly lonely and sad and thinks, if I have a baby, that baby will love me. Then I'll have something. I'll have something to hold on to if I have a child. We'll come back in just a minute.